Imagine this. The vice president of a country is sitting in an impeachment trial, not because she lost an election, not because she was arrested, but because lawmakers accuse her of serious wrongdoing involving hundreds of millions of pesos in government funds. And now, the country's Senate is acting as a court to decide whether she could be still remain in office. This is not a fictional political drama. This is happening right now in the Philippines. And the woman at the center of it is Vice President Sara Duterte. So what exactly is happening? Why is she being impeached? What are the allegations? And most importantly, could the Vice President of the Philippines actually be removed from the office? Hi, I'm Nix, and this is Nix Now. And if you're curious about the Philippines beyond its beaches and tourist destination, make sure to subscribe because these channels explore the country's politics, economy, society, and the issues shaping its future. Now, let's begin. Actually Sara Duterte. First, let's understand who we're talking about. Sara Duterte is the daughter of the former president Rodrigo Duterte. She became the vice president of the Philippines in 2022 election after winning the country's national election. And here's something important. The Philippines or the Philippine president and the vice president are elected separately. So even though Sara Duterte ran along a different political coalition from President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., she became the vice president while Marcos became the president. For the first time, the two political families were closely associated, but the relationship eventually deteriorated, and the political conflict between Marcos and Duterte has become one of the biggest political stories in the Philippines.
Kasi may kinausap na ako na tao. Sinabi ko sa kanya, kapag pinatay ako, patayin mo si BBM, si Lisa Araneta, at si Martin Romualdez. No joke.
Now, the political background matters, but the impeachment is not supposed to be simply about the political disagreements of the two parties. It is a constitutional process, and that is where the current case comes in. Why is she being impeached? At the center of the current impeachment trial is the alleged misuse and misappropriation of the confidential fund. The amount being scrutinized is an enormous amount of 612.5 million pesos, and that is roughly tens of millions of US dollars. These funds were allocated to office under Sara Duterte, particularly to the Office of the Vice President or the OVP, and during her time as Education Secretary of the Department of Education. The prosecution argues that there was serious problem involving how this confidential fund were spent, documented, and liquidated. And the defense, however, maintains that there was no misuse of the funds. And this is the distinction is really extremely important. An allegation is not the same as conviction. The Senate is currently in the hearing evidence. It has not yet issued a final judgment. What are the confidential funds anyway? If you're watching from another country, you might be wondering what exactly the confidential fund. In the Philippines, confidential intelligence funds are government funds intended for the activities involving things like intelligence gathering, security, and law enforcement related operations. Because of the sensitive nature of this kind of activities, they are subject different documentation and auditing procedures from ordinary government expenses. But that doesn't mean that the money is completely outside of the government accountability. That is one of the major questions in the impeachment case. Were these funds actually used for legitimate confidential activities, or where government funds improperly spent or documented. That is what the Senate is trying to determine. Now, one of the most important issues involved the speed at which some of these confidential funds were spent. Auditors and lawmakers have examined disbursement made by the Office of the Vice President or the OVP, and during the trial, the evidence has been presented concerning the large amount of money being distributed within the relatively short period of time. The prosecution has argued that this kind of spending pattern raised a very large question about whether the funds were properly used. This is where the trials gets very complicated, because the question isn't simply did the money disappear? The government has records showing where the money was supposedly spent. The real question are, who received it? Who was it for? Was the activity legitimate? Or were the required documents accurate? And, of course, can the spending actually be verified? Those questions are now being debated before the Senate. The COA as the witness. And this brings us to the latest development. During the day 15 of the trial on August 12, Commission on Audit, Auditor Zailene May Del Campo testified about the handling and disbursement of confidential fund of the Office of the Vice President. COA is the Philippines Constitutional Auditing Body, or the Commission on Audit. Think of it as an institution responsible for checking how government money is spent. So when the COA auditor takes the witness stand in an impeachment trial, her testimony can be extremely important. Del Campo raised concern about the aspect of OVP confidential fund spending. One of the examples discussed during the proceeding was approximately 16 million pesos spent on the safe house rental over roughly 11 days. The auditor characterized the amount as substantial and relatively high. Because imagine, the 16 million was spent only for 11 days. But here's another important distinction. COA did not necessarily declare that particular expenditure irregular simply because the amount was high. Reports said that the expense was supported by the required documentation. So again, high spending does not automatically equal illegal spending. The Senate has to examine the evidence and determine what it means in the context of the impeachment charges. Another major development reported during the trial is concerning the 73.287 million pesos is disallowed disbursements. According to the report on COA testimony, the auditor said Sara Duterte herself, along with the two others, was considered liable for the amount. But what does disallow mean? It doesn't automatically mean that someone has been convicted of stealing money. A COA notice is disallowance means that an expenditure has been found not allowable under the auditing rules and may be subject to refund and other legal process. And this distinction matters enormously when discussing the case internationally, because social media can turn COA disallow as an expenditure into stole the money. Sara Duterte stole the money. Those are not necessarily means the same legal conclusion. The Senate still has to determine whether the evidence proves an impeachment offense. So, what does Sara Duterte defense say? Her lawyers has consistently rejected the accusation that the confidential funds were misused. The defense has challenged the prosecution interpretation of documents and questioned the significance of some of the evidence being presented. And the defense position is essentially questionable looking transaction does not automatically prove criminal or impeachment conduct. And that is why the trial is become a battle of documents, witness, accounting procedures, and of course, the interpretation of government rules. Isn't simply a political shouting match. At least legally, the Senate must eventually decide whether the evidence satisfy the constitutional requirements for the impeachment. And here's where the story gets very more interesting. Because this current Senate trial could happen, there's another impeachment case involving Sara. In 2025, the Supreme Court ruled the earlier impeachment proceeding violates the Constitution's one-year bar rule that's effectively stopped the previous case. But the Supreme Court ruling did not mean Sara Duterte has been cleared of all the allegations. It means that another impeachment complaint could be pursued after the constitutional restriction expired. A new impeachment process followed in 2028. And on August 5, the Supreme Court dismissed petition challenging the House proceedings involving the current impeachment case. That removed another legal obstacle to the Senate trial continuing. And as of now, the Senate Impeachment Court is proceeding with the case. Now here is a lot of questions. Why is this politically huge? Now let's talk back from the courtroom. Why does this matter so much? Because Sara Duterte isn't just another government official. She is sitting as Vice President of the Philippines, and she remained a major political figure. Her father, Rodrigo Duterte, remains one of the most influential and controversial political figures in the recent Philippine history. The Duterte family also has a powerful political base, particularly in the island of Mindanao. So this case has consequences far beyond the question of government accounting. It is happening against the backdrop of the major political split between the Duterte and Marcos camps, in with the Philippines looking forward or looking toward the next presidential election cycle. Whatever happens to Sara Duterte could significantly affect the country's political landscape. Can she actually be removed? Well, the real answer is yes, but it isn't automatic. The Senate is currently acting as an impeachment court, and the senator judges will eventually have vote for the charges. And conviction requires the constitutionally required supermajority. If convicted, Sara Duterte could be removed from office and potentially face the constitutional consequences attached to the impeachment. But until that happens, she remain the Vice President of the Philippines. And that's another important distinction. She has been impeached by the House, she is currently on trial before the Senate, and she has not been convicted. So, the question is, what happens next? As of August 13th of this year, the trial has completed its 15th day. The Senate Impeachment Court has adjourned, and the schedule to resume is Monday on August 17, 2026. The proceedings are expected to continue examining evidence surrounding the confidential fund allegation. And this could still take time, because there are a lot of witnesses to hear, documents to examine, arguments from both sides, questions from senator judges, and eventually, the final is the verdict. So despite all the headlines you've seen, we are not at the end of this story. We are still in the evidence phase. If you're watching from outside of the Philippines, here's probably the simplest way to understand what is happening. The Vice President of the Philippines is facing an impeachment trial. The central allegation involving handling of the alleged misuse of hundreds of millions of pesos in confidential government funds. Auditors have testified. The prosecution says that the evidence raised serious questions, and the defense says the allegation has not established wrongdoing. And the Senate now has the responsibility of deciding what the evidence actually proves. This is bigger than one politician, because ultimately the case asks a question that democracies around the world constantly struggle with. How much accountability should the people in the highest level of the government face when they control public money? And at the same time, how do we make sure that accountability does not simply a weapon in a political fight. Those are two different questions, and the Senate or the Philippine Senate now has to navigate both. This is Nix for now. See you in the next video. Bye!